All right, let's get started. We are honored to have these discussions licensed attorney and professional fiduciary Darby Jones, a member of the Florida and Maryland Bar. Darby serves on the Executive Council of the Real Property Probate Trust Law section of the Florida Bar and is a registered professional guardian. Darby is also the founder and executive director of the Professional Fiduciary Council of Florida. Today, we're going to discuss how best to protect our loved ones from fraud and financial exploitation. Darby, what advice can you give a caregiver who may be struggling with an uncooperative or abusive family members, or a professional caregiver that we think might be defrauding our loved one?
Well, thank you for that introduction. And also thank you everybody for being here today. We have some very important information to share with you. And we also have an incredibly qualified guest speaker today who's going to be sharing important tips, solutions, precautions. But first, I did want to take a minute just to thank everybody for being here. We feel, I can speak for Michelle and Chandra and myself, that we feel some real traction coming along with this Aging Academy, and we wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. And we're so excited to see the response and the communication that we're getting from our audience. I see some familiar faces and names out there. So just thank you. And please let other people know, because we don't have a marketing budget. You're looking at the marketing budget right here. So if you can share and like and tell people about it, register with the AARP virtual calendar, we would all be very grateful. And also don't forget, as Michelle mentioned, we were actually mentioned in the most recent AARP bulletin, which I think has also maybe caused some of this recent excitement. But I did just want to say thank you to all of you, and also to the AARP for making this happen. It's important, and it's obviously resonating with a lot of people. Today, we have an incredible expert. I'm going to let her introduce herself a little more thoroughly in just a minute. Her name is Karen Murillo. She is an attorney, and she has incredible experience with exploitation and vulnerable adults in the state of Florida. She is currently serving as the state director, or associate state director of advocacy in Florida on this special topic. And we're going to divide our presentation today into kind of three categories. The first thing we're going to talk about is the precursors to exploitation. Some of the things that you yourself might want to watch out for or prepare for yourself, or for your loved one, or for the caregiver who might be coming on the scene. Or if you are the caregiver, how to protect your client or your friend or your family member. Then we're going to move into a discussion of what is exploitation, how to report it, who to report it to. And then we're going to end the conversation today with resources and tips on how to prevent getting yourself into this situation to begin with, or loved ones into this situation to begin with. Now, remember, statistically, 70% of people over the age of 65 are going to need some level of care. Of course, that means 30% of people over 65 aren't going to need care. But regardless of what side that statistic you fall down on, you're going to need this information that you're hearing today. So I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad to turn it over to Karen. I'm going to let her speak a little more directly about her experience and what she's going to be able to bring to us today. So welcome, Karen, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. And as Darby introduced, I will clarify, I have no personal experience with exploitation, but with prosecuting exploitation and helping out others prevent and understand how to prevent exploitation. I'm located here in Florida along with my co-worker, Michelle, who you heard from earlier today. And I have a background in criminal prosecution of crimes against seniors, exploitation in particular, financial crimes of fraud and exploitation, elder abuse issues, and I've worked with the Florida Attorney General's office and led the Senior Protection Team initiative for a period of time prior to joining AARP. So going to be talking to you kind of from that lens of what we've seen go wrong and how we might prevent you or your loved one from becoming one of those cases or those statistics. As Darby mentioned, one of the ways that we're going to talk about this is by going into some precursors to exploitation, some vulnerability factors, if you will, about how somebody might be more vulnerable or more susceptible to exploitation. And I will point out that one of the primary issues that we see when it comes to exploitation, abuse, neglect, across the board, social isolation is very often either a precursor to this or something that is used by an exploiter or abuser to kind of conceal what they're doing. And social isolation is really a problem and a barrier to reporting exploitation, to notifying and recognizing exploitation fast. It's also the perfect way for somebody to have somebody sneak into their lives who may not have the best intentions. So as we talk about some of the ways that we can prevent exploitation or we can try to address exploitation in our communities, I think it behooves us to say that the most important and maybe one of the easiest ways that we can kind of address this issue is by staying socially connected ourselves and with our loved ones and those in our community. All of us need to feel a sense of belonging to a community, whether we have family located close or far away, whether we are an individual that doesn't have any remaining living relatives. We all need to be part of a community of some sort, and that looks different for everyone. But just keeping that in mind, that often ends up being a way to both prevent and for early detection when it comes to exploitation scenarios. As you may have seen in the description for this particular episode, we talk about siblings a little bit in exploitation scenarios, family conflicts. Now, exploitation can be committed by somebody who is a professional. You heard Michelle mention maybe a professional caregiver, maybe somebody in a medical profession, maybe somebody in a legal profession or financial profession who has access to this more vulnerable person. But oftentimes we see exploitation happening right within the home with somebody who is related to the vulnerable older adult. And as sad as that sounds, it's an unfortunate reality and important factor, because we can maybe take some steps within our family and our dynamics in our family to kind of prevent or preempt that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. One of the things that we see contributing to strife later on as people age is this blended family, having marriages with children from multiple marriages, and these adult children who all have a different perspective or thought process on how things should be handled for their aging loved one, their aging parent or aunt, uncle, what have you. And that can really create a lot of blind spots and a lot of scenarios where people do end up exploiting, whether it starts intentional or not, or at the very least, it can result in a lot of problems with families staying together and working towards the benefit and well-being of their loved one. So, as Darby mentioned, we'll kind of go more towards the end into how to preempt or prevent these precursors. But you're probably starting to hear some of those themes already in what I'm suggesting are precursors, right? Family conflicts, trying to resolve these as early on and make sure wishes are known as early on is a huge way to prevent exploitation and abuse, as well as to recognize when something is wrong. And just like with that social isolation component, sometimes early detection is really one of the most important ways that we can prevent somebody from really suffering, especially for, losing their entire life savings and having this vulnerability and insecurity financially later in life. So that kind of leads into one of my next thoughts of precursors. Planning ahead. We see a lot of times cases of exploitation, of abuse within family members, where there wasn't a clear-cut plan in place, whether that's because maybe mom or dad didn't feel like it was appropriate to talk about finances with their kids. Maybe they prefer for that to be kept very private. Believe me, I get that. My own family has always been very reluctant to talk about money issues. Or maybe mom or dad doesn't want to talk about, what do I want to see done if I come to a point that I need to have a caregiver, or that I need long-term care assistance, or what do I want to have done if I'm in a predicament health-wise. All of these situations, if you don't plan for them ahead of time, what you risk is having this happen, kind of organically at a time when it's an emergency, and people making a lot of fast decisions that may or may not be what you would have chosen for yourself. And again, that leads back into that conflict with families, right? A lot of these exploitation cases start because there was a breakdown in communication between these siblings. And one sibling decides, you know what, I'm gonna pull rank here. I'm gonna take care of mom, and I'm also going to control her finances, and I'm going to control who she speaks with, and so forth. It becomes kind of a slippery slope in a lot of respects. So planning ahead and having very clear conversations about those plans with your family members can really help prevent a lot of heartache later on down the road. And I've already fallen into the trap that I tell everybody else, watch out for. Exploitation is not solely something that happens with advanced age. We tend to talk about elder exploitation. We tend to talk about it with vulnerable seniors or older adults. But the reality is that exploitation can happen at any age. There are adults of all kinds of capabilities, capacities, and you may have temporary incapacities. So, as an example, one of my exploitation cases that I prosecuted involved an individual who was under the age of 60. She had a surgery on some sort of leg surgery, but it was a very invasive procedure. And so she was on a lot of pain medication and really required assistance in the immediate aftermath of that surgery. And unfortunately, a professional caregiver in that case utilized this time frame where she was maybe not as oriented and maybe as capable to recognize when there were problems with her finances to take advantage of her. So keep in mind that as we're talking about exploitation and we're talking about all of these factors, it can happen at any age. And that's also why it's so critical to talk about planning as early as possible, and to have those conversations continuing as you age.
Karen, I'm going to pop in just for a second here. And along your point of the conversation, which is just, you're going to hear that 1,000 times today, but the other recommendation I have is when you do have a conversation with your family or the person who you feel is going to be in that role of a fiduciary on your behalf, make sure you have it with more than one person so that everybody is hearing kind of the same thing. But for example, there's always a problem with what we call tangible personal property, the stuff. At the end of the day, who's going to get what? And it's always good to have that conversation with everybody so that everybody's hearing that this person's getting the clock, this person's getting the sofa, this person's getting the car, instead of that becoming a real issue. I can tell you that of the dozens and dozens and dozens of estates that I've had to administer over the years, that property gets to be such a chasm in a family. I mean, it will rip a family apart over a pocket watch or a vase. So I know we're talking about exploitation and so forth, but that is sort of evolves into a family division just over the tangible personal property.
And I think that's a fair point, because we haven't gotten into really the crux of what exploitation actually is in terms of elements yet. But the reality is that exploitation can be taking money from somebody's bank. It can be changing their will or trust or other testamentary type of agreement or contract or device. And it can also be taking physical property. I mean, like there are so many different ways that exploitation can occur. And I agree with Darby's point wholeheartedly when we're talking about avoiding these potential family conflicts, especially when you've got, kids from multiple marriages who may or may not have, a relationship with one another. You want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Everybody heard the exact same description of what you want to see happen and how you plan on carrying out your aging years or time of vulnerability, if it's in the aftermath of a surgery, what have you, making sure everybody is clear as to who you want to take point on that. We talk about the fiduciary and appointing a fiduciary. If you haven't talked to all of the siblings as to why, the eldest sibling was designated as the fiduciary, that may cause some problems later on where people think, you know what, mom didn't even like you. She wouldn't have done this. She wouldn't have appointed you. Having those conversations up front really does help prevent those conflicts and sometimes fabricated conflicts.
Well, and I think it's also a real hurdle for people getting their estate planning done, which is, to your point here, the failure to plan. And these blended families, the parents are so afraid of having those conversations that they then don't go get their estate planning done because they don't want to have that conversation with each other or the attorney or anyone. So you've just got to face these issues. And like Karen's saying, even if you only speak to your children of the blended family, speak to all of them. Okay, so make some inroads into those tough, difficult conversations, because it can lead to disaster if you don't.
I'll also share a personal story with you all and tell you that, you may hear me say that age is not a factor and think, well, that's easy for her to say. She's not in this situation or she doesn't understand. Listen, at the age of 29, my husband had cancer, was going through surgery. I became a caregiver and I was thrust into this role very unexpectedly. And he underwent surgery. And during that surgery, the doctors came out and asked me a really important question about what we would like to see done based off of something unexpected, right? And I had to answer that without having really gone through in depth that discussion with my husband. That's a really specific example, I know. But my point is that regardless of how old you are or what stage of life you're in, the unexpected happens. And so having these conversations early and often are one of the best ways that you can really prevent this from festering and becoming an issue later on down the road. Having those conversations with everybody at the table, being part of that, but also making sure that you're checking in periodically to say, this is still how I feel, or maybe my position on this has changed over time with respect to like medical care, for example. And all of these things really do feed into exploitation. I know that we're talking about financial exploitation, and I'm hitting upon medical things. Well, sometimes those medical decisions end up becoming part of an exploitation consideration and case down the road. So all of this really does relate to one another in terms of how exploitation happens and how we prevent it. Two other factors that have nothing to do with age, or may not have anything to do with age, are mental health and substance abuse. These are all two additional factors that can really lead into an exploitation scenario. And that's, mental health considerations or substance abuse issues for either the person who ultimately can be victimized by exploitation, or for their family members or people in their immediate, orbit in their community. We've seen cases, I'm sure Darby can provide a handful of cases where we've seen, a child who unfortunately has a substance abuse addiction, and in order to help fund that substance abuse addiction, decides to tap into mom's bank account for it. And mom doesn't know what's going on, or maybe doesn't have the ability to object or intervene. But also mental health considerations, people who have a serious mental health issue and go off of medication can suddenly become very vulnerable or susceptible to being exploited. Likewise, having an adult child within the home who has a mental health consideration, that is something that can cause friction later on if that hasn't been discussed. That can sometimes cause, alienation and that social isolation factor, and potentially create a scenario for exploitation if not everybody is part of that conversation of what mom wants to see done, or what I want to see done for finances or health, etc. And the last one that I'll touch upon in terms of a vulnerability consideration is housing insecurity. We've seen homelessness and people with concerns regarding their security around housing. That can put someone in a vulnerable and precarious position to where they're taken advantage of. One of the ways that happens is with respect to benefits. So we've seen cases in which people here in Florida, where I've prosecuted, coming out of homeless shelters, go into a sort of transitional living scenario, and somebody within that transitional living scenario says, hey, I'll help you apply for and get all of these benefits, but you're going to make me your payee. And suddenly this person is being utilized for financial benefits that they're getting from the government. I mean, there are so many ways that exploitation can occur, and these are just a couple of things that can be warning signs, red flags, precursors to exploitation occurring. But wanted to kind of go through all of those and make sure that we, brought it up for consideration, because I'm sure each of us has at least a piece of this that we can think of, oh, this relates to me, or this relates to my family.
And I want to reach out to Annie. Thank you for your question, and we will get to that. She's asking, what do you do if you are dealing with a bank and it's their fault? What are next steps? And we will get to that, Annie. So thank you for that question.
So, I mean, I think that leads into kind of our second component of this conversation, which is what is exploitation and what do you do, right? Now, exploitation is a term of legal art, especially here in Florida. We have very specific definitions of what exploitation is. And I know that we've got people who, I saw from the chat, we've got somebody from Pennsylvania here, somebody from New York here. So regardless of where you're at, I'm going to try to make this as broadly applicable as possible and say that exploitation, even if it's not named that, is more than likely criminalized in your state. And exploitation almost always requires somebody has to report to Adult Protective Services. Now, what exactly the components of exploitation look like, that may vary somewhat from state to state. The main things to consider are, is this somebody that is known to the victim, somebody that is close to them? Now, that can be, like I've already described, a family member. That can be somebody who they've hired and trust, like an attorney or a accountant or an investment advisor or a professional caregiver. Sometimes this is a neighbor. Sometimes this is an acquaintance of somebody you meet at church who then becomes more. So the real crux of this is somebody who either has a relationship with your loved one or develops that close relationship so that your loved one trusts them and depends on them. And then there's a violation of that trust in some way. And that may be, as Darby's already mentioned, taking some finances from the bank account or physical property in some cases. That may be liquidating retirement accounts and moving money around, maybe paying for your own bills out of mom's finances. There are a lot of ways that exploitation can occur. It also can involve real property. We've seen cases of exploitation where somebody transfers the deed or title to land or a home into someone else's name, while mom or dad either is unaware or they're tricked or deceived into doing this, or potentially mom or dad doesn't have the capacity or wherewithal to agree to this or not agree to this. The real, I guess, question or litmus test, if you will, of is this exploitation? It's going to be, is there that violation of trust? Is this person doing something not for the benefit of the person who is more vulnerable here, the person who needs to be protected? Now, that's a really basic explanation of exploitation. And I'll tell you that it changes based off of those professional obligations too. There tend to be a lot more, there tend to be higher standards when it comes to professional individuals who take that fiduciary responsibility. Like Darby and I as attorneys, we're held to a higher standard than somebody down the street if we are working with somebody who is vulnerable or later becomes vulnerable. And we have an obligation to act in our client's best interest. Well, if we are doing things that are only for our good, we're taking money and spending it on what we want to spend it on instead of spending it on what our client needs. That could be an example of exploitation. And, I want to also explain that I think I touched upon with the housing insecurity consideration that it doesn't have to be stealing from mom's bank account for it to count as theft and exploitation. Sometimes it is stealing benefits before they ever arrive to mom. Sometimes it's not stealing at all. For example, in Florida, it is a crime of exploitation, or it could count as a crime of exploitation for somebody who is a power of attorney to just say, you know what, not paying for any of mom's bills, not going to, pay for her needs. I'm not taking the money, but I mean, I don't see why she needs to have cable and internet at the house. And, there's a sea breeze. So why do we really need to have an air conditioning unit that works? Why do we need to? So taking care of the necessities for a person when you're in that responsibility or role to do so, if you fail to do so, that may be a form of exploitation or at the very least neglect. So we've talked about kind of a variety of forms of exploitation, and that's only touching the tip of the iceberg here. I'm sure you can all think of a lot of variations that I haven't even covered yet, which we'll hopefully get to a little bit more in your questions. One thing that I want to throw out there about going back to that isolation component for a second. In Florida, we've actually criminalized social isolation in some scenarios. When someone begins socially isolating someone from their family members for a length of time that could cause psychological harm, or they're doing it to hide what they're actually doing, like committing exploitation or abuse or what have you, that is considered a crime in and of itself. Not every state has that law, but there are ways for law enforcement and social services to intervene sooner rather than later, rather than waiting until it gets to that point of there being a true emergency. So when you see those red flags popping up, you see that somebody is suddenly not speaking with friends and family, they're suddenly being kept, behind closed doors and really limited in their interactions. It might be something worth reaching out and asking for a welfare check from law enforcement, asking for social services to get involved. And I think that for purposes of the mandatory reporting, we haven't really gone into that yet. So let me make sure I make a point of this. Regardless of what state you're in, every state in the US has some form of mandatory reporting requirement for abuse, neglect, and exploitation of vulnerable or older adults. I gave you the legalese, I know. Suffice it to say, if it looks like abuse or neglect or exploitation of somebody who is in a more vulnerable position, whether that's because of age or that's because of mental health or any of the other things that we've talked about already, some of which we haven't, most states have a responsibility for everyone to report. In Florida, that's the case. Regardless of what your occupation is, regardless of who you are with relation to that person who's being abused or exploited, if you know or reasonably suspect that this is occurring, you have a legal obligation to report the matter to Department of Children and Families, which is our social services here, or Adult Protective Services. And every state has some form of adult protective services and mandatory reporting process. As I mentioned, some states are going to have slightly different requirements, and sometimes it's only required of a certain professional or a list of professionals. In fact, under Florida law, we have a list of professionals who definitely have to report. So it's like doubly legally required.
And I will tell you that I have used that very often. And it never ceases to amaze me how many people are unaware of that obligation, including professionals, even here in Florida, where you would think it would be pretty common knowledge. And I also wanted to mention I don't know if we want to talk about it now. I know it's on our list about bank accounts and so forth. And is this a good time to share that story that I have? You've got to be very careful about your loved ones' bank accounts, and overall make sure that whoever is that named power of attorney, if you want to go back and look at our very first episode, which is what is a fiduciary and how to name the appropriate fiduciary, please go back and watch that, because we go into a deep dive on what a fiduciary really is and how that word is so misused and watered down in many, many ways. But sometimes that friendly neighbor, that friend from church, the person who thinks they're just helping out, they start off with a good intent. They start off thinking they're doing the right thing and helping. But as Karen mentioned, sometimes it grows and grows into something, then gets out of control. So the young lady next door who's helping the elderly woman with groceries, well, she just borrows $20 that week and promises she's going to pay it back, which never gets paid back. And then that $20 grows to $40, and the $40 grows to more. And then her car breaks down, and then her boyfriend needs money. And it just starts getting out of control. And she sees how easy it was to get that money from this elderly person. And again, not someone that's incompetent, not someone that's unable, but just vulnerable. Many of us, just like Karen pointed out, are vulnerable. My 22-year-old son is vulnerable to scams. Okay, so you just have to really worry about who it is that's around your family member. So for example, this happens often, that the neighbor who's trying to help, or the whatever, and the daughter or the son or the family live out of state or at a great distance away. And they just assume everything's fine. And mom and dad are going to say, yeah, everything's fine. We got this little girl neighbor who comes over and helps us with our stuff. Don't assume that that's fine. Don't assume that everything is okay. It may be, and yay for that. But in this state, given the huge isolation that goes on in this state in particular, and our great population of orphaned adults, it's very often not fine. And so DCF is called frequently. I have done it many times. And the good news is, and I'm assuming, Karen, that most of it in every state is anonymous. If you call the DCF and report exploitation, they're not going to say, oh, Darby called about it. They're not going to say who called. Now, usually it's pretty obvious who did, but they will send someone out within 24 hours to knock on that door and do an investigation. And even if nothing comes of it, it'll scare that neighbor, because that may be all it takes to get that little do-gooder to stop doing whatever they were doing. I mean, I had an example where a lady was in an assisted living facility, not incompetent, but quite vulnerable. She allowed the cook at that facility to become her power of attorney. That gentleman proceeded to steal everything, sold her house, got all her bank accounts, literally everything, left her penniless. He took hundreds of thousands of dollars, moved out of state, and opened a restaurant. And the woman was destitute at that point. She didn't have the funds to even hire a lawyer because there was no money left. So that is such a sad case. And here's someone that she thought would have been in a position of trust, but really a cook at a assisted living facility is not really, obviously he was breaking his own rules with the facility itself. But this is what's so important. Her family out of state had no idea that that was happening. And she was too embarrassed to admit that it happened. So it's a sad situation, but don't think that everybody that's doing good things for your mom or dad or spouse will always be that, because sometimes it grows into something that they didn't intend. Sorry to interrupt with that one, but.
No, not at all. I think you threw out a lot of really important concepts and thoughts there, and I'm trying to make sure I keep them organized in my brain. One of the things that Darby just mentioned with bank accounts and there not having to be a vulnerability factor, I'll share that, disability, physical disability or diminishment of ability is absolutely something that can make somebody more vulnerable. And I have prosecuted a case where a individual had absolutely sharp as a whip, had no intellectual or capacity problems whatsoever, but they were blind. And they relied on somebody to help them with writing out checks and paying bills. And that person took advantage of that trust and started paying their own bills and started writing checks out for their own needs. So anything that puts somebody in a more vulnerable position can potentially put them in a scenario where they could be exploited. Mm-hmm. And it may be, writing checks. It may be transferring money out of accounts. What Darby mentioned with the bank accounts piece, and I want to give Darby a chance to go back to that if she wants to. I just want to say, just like Darby was saying with the power of attorney and fiduciary considerations and being really cognizant and careful about who you select for that, who you put on an account or who you allow the bank to communicate with or allow to transact on your account or do things on your behalf, that person needs to be a trustworthy, reliable person, because they can abuse and misuse those opportunities in some instances and have, unfortunately. We say that because we've seen it happen.
Well, let me also caution everyone. If you think, oh, I'm going to put my daughter on my account because it'll be so much easier for her to pay my bills and, she's going to take care of my finances, and your daughter might be the greatest thing on earth. The problem is, do not, if you don't remember anything from today other than abuse hotline, is do not put people on your bank account as a joint owner. Okay, that is a huge mistake. Don't do it. And don't listen to financial or estate planning advice from your banker or teller or drive-through teller. Do not put people's names on your account unless it's your spouse. And the reason is, your daughter might be the best person on the planet and do everything right, but just make her your agent under your power of attorney and have her have access to your bank account to write bills and checks, but don't put her on the account, because she may, heaven forbid, have a car accident and run over a 30-year-old wage earner with 3 children. And then guess what? Your bank account, because she's now an owner of it, because you put her on there as a joint owner, your bank account is now brought into that car accident litigation. Or let's say she runs up a gambling debt. Or let's say her husband runs up a gambling debt. Or let's say she wants to get divorced. Anything that goes on to that person that you added to your account, you just piled all their potential liability onto your bank account. And it's a huge mistake. I see it all the time. Just have them on your account as your power of attorney. That's the best way to resolve and have that convenience that they can still write checks, they still have access to your account, but they're not an owner. Off my soapbox for now. That's soapbox.
Again, there's so many layers here, and we don't want to get too far into the weeds, but know what that power of attorney document allows and doesn't allow.
Mm-hmm.
In Florida, for example, we don't have the ability to create a power of attorney that is conditioned upon somebody losing capacity. So if you sign a power of attorney in Florida today, that power of attorney is valid today. You have capacity, but that document is also valid. So know what the legal parameters are of these documents. Make sure that the people who are managing your finances or managing your property estates, managing your healthcare considerations, also know who these people are and what the parameters are, what that contract says, what you're allowing them to make decisions about. And I'll say too that the joint account issue has prevented some cases from being prosecuted in Florida and elsewhere. And in some instances, having somebody listed on that account may mean that we can't prove that a theft actually occurred, even though you put them on your account for one purpose. Mm-hmm. Actually, they're taking that money and using it as they want to, but law enforcement may look at that and say, you know what, civilly, they're entitled to that money.
Or she told me I could have it. She said I could have it. She told me to sell the house.
In Florida, I'll tell you that we have crafted language in our laws that help prevent that from being like the excuse that somebody relies upon. We can prosecute somebody for exploitation, even if they're on the account, depending on the circumstances. But that is certainly something that makes exploitation a heck of a lot easier and sometimes prevents anybody from being able to intervene from social services or law enforcement.
Now let's touch on the question that Annie had about, because I don't want to run out of time to talk about the preventative measures that we need to put in place, which are many. So very quickly, the bank issue, if she's saying that the fraud was committed, it was the bank's fault, what does she do?
So depending on how your state reporting structure is set up, I mean, the first place that I would start in every state, including Florida, is reporting to the hotline. If this is somebody who is a vulnerable adult, whether that's because of age or some other vulnerability factor, and they're being exploited, report to the hotline, to your adult protective services, and report to law enforcement. And I say that and I stress it because most of the states that have these mandatory reporting laws, it says mandatory to report to adult protective services or to social services. But social services doesn't always have the ability to intervene. That does not mean that a crime isn't occurring. So in every instance, I encourage people to also notify law enforcement if a crime is occurring. We want law enforcement to be able to jump in there and intervene sooner and hopefully prevent significant financial losses in the case of exploitation.
Yeah, it's worth it to get a police report for sure. Definitely.
Oh, absolutely. And when we're talking about fraud, especially exploitation too, that police report may later be used as evidence to help prevent you from having a debt that somebody got against you or got against your credit. It may be the way that you can legally resolve issues with your finances down the road because of something that somebody else did in your name. And the other thing that I want to make sure I touch upon when it's a financial institution, when it's a somebody who has that trusted role with finances or investment advising or attorneys, for example, most of these people are in regulated professions. So something really important to keep in mind is if they are in a regulated profession, such as an investment advisor, it is also important that we notify the legal or professional board that regulates them. In the case of an attorney, if an attorney commits exploitation, in addition to notifying the Adult Protective Services and law enforcement, I'm also going to notify the Florida Bar, because we want to make sure that as many people who can intervene and take steps to prevent this from happening further are aware and in the loop. And also the bank in this instance. Any employer is going to want to maintain a safe environment and maintain their reputation. So if you're seeing something, remember that old saying, see something, say something, speak up, make sure you raise this with the employer, in this case the bank, so that they know what their employees are up to and they can take appropriate action to prevent this from happening or stop it in process.
Okay, let's touch on some of the preventative things real quickly, if you don't mind. I know everybody's time is important, but I just want to throw out some tips for our audience. And I know we have a lot of concern from people in our audience who are orphaned adults, who are all by themselves, and don't have any sons or don't have any daughters to ultimately take care of them. But to stay that connection in the beginning, that conversation, that connection, the community, for orphaned adults, sometimes that's a little challenging. So what my recommendation is, and what Karen and I discussed before today, are several things that you can do now to prevent yourself from maybe being in a position of having that goody two-shoes neighbor coming over and starting to take advantage. So number one is to connect to people. Let them know who your fiduciary is. Let them know who your daughter is in Nebraska or California. When your daughter visits, take her with you to your church, to your bingo, to your hairdresser, to your banker, to your lawyer, to your financial advisor. So they are meeting her. They know her, him or her. They are familiar with who they are. They have their contact information. There was an example just recently where a woman who came to the same hairdresser for years, all of a sudden she came in one day and was not herself. She couldn't orient herself. She couldn't find her wallet. She didn't really even remember her name. And the hairdresser was just so heartbroken because she didn't know who to call. She had no idea who to call for this woman. So I know that sounds kind of goofy, but the truth is you have to create community in your own world. And if your world is the hairdresser and bingo or pickleball or, the banker that you go see that's your community. And reach out and make that contact. And when your son or daughter visits, make that effort for them to go with you, and your financial advisor, introduce them, your lawyer, all those people, so that if, for example, you're just dropping crumbs, and you're going to hope that if something were to happen, they would know who to call and how to protect you, or know that this person coming in the bank with you isn't the right person, and hopefully put up a red flag. Let's talk about some other preventative measures that might help.
Absolutely. So in addition to dropping those breadcrumbs by physically being present and interacting with the people in your loved one's life, being listed as their emergency contact in case of emergency is also a very important thing. Having those documents like power of attorneys filed or healthcare surrogacy documents, if you have somebody who is going to be making medical decisions, having all of that filed with the people who need it, your doctors, the hospital, all of these different organizations or businesses. And when it comes to finances in particular, there is a newer concept of something called a trusted contact. And this goes back to that. This can happen at any age, and anything can happen at any age. Fraud can happen at any age. Having a trusted contact listed on your account is a safeguard for you. It is a safeguard regardless of your age, capability, what have you, regardless of whether you have $5 in the bank or $1 million in the bank. Having somebody that the bank is authorized to reach out to if they think something is up, something seems off, that helps prevent and stop exploitation and fraud while it's occurring. Having a trusted contact on your bank account listed with your bank may be the thing that stops a fraudulent transaction from going through. So, having all of those people in your life and having them connected with the right resources. Also asking for help and we acknowledge at the beginning of this conversation that there's a lot of shame and embarrassment around fraud, around exploitation, but this is a crime, and like any other crime, the person who's responsible and culpable here is the wrongdoer, the exploiter in this case, or the fraudster in this case. So ask for help. Waiting and trying to bury it in moments of vulnerability can really just delay and potentially open somebody up to having more problems down the line and being exploited. I see Darby smiling there.
Well, I see Michelle's correcting me to say solo agers instead of orphaned adults. Like that's probably a much better way of saying it. Thank you, Michelle. But again, another story, quick, horrible story is, this is where professionals can also fall into the category of exploiters. We have a community here in Pinellas County of a very high population of solo agers, although she's not solo. She had a daughter out of state. She went to the eye doctor. Her vision was very bad. Again, one of the disabilities that add to the possibility of it being exploited. The actual receptionist at the eye doctor's office solicited her by saying, "Oh, don't you need help? You need to help with paying your bills or reading the mail." Sure enough, her daughter was Johnny on the spot to help people. Daughter shows up with bouquet of flowers, takes her to the bank. She had 5 CDs, $100,000 in each one. And this exploiter daughter helper had each CD changed as POD to her. And the bank went along with it. The daughter, who lived out of state, had no idea this was happening. Now, again, this is a real under the radar kind of thing to do, is to change accounts with POD or TOD. This woman was very elderly. The little girl knew good and well it's just a matter of time. And the daughter had no idea it happened. When it was discovered, the woman herself was so mortified and so embarrassed that she would not allow us to report the doctor and that receptionist, which again is heartbreaking, because just to think how many people that receptionist and daughter team have abused or taken advantage of. So it's a horrible story, but again, that daughter out of state, she's probably her mother's power of attorney, should have been on the account and be able to watch, and should have introduced herself to the bank with mom, so that when someone shows up with a stranger, hopefully it'll ring some bells.
And, Darby used POD, payable upon death, whether it's changing who is paid at the time of death from an account, whether it's changing a will or another type of testamentary device, that can be a form of exploitation. So keep that in mind as well. We talked about the importance of planning ahead, and we've already talked about how picking your fiduciary, your power of attorney, and being very cautious and conscientious about that is important. As same with healthcare surrogates, same with trust and who you designate as a trustee. And keep in mind that we see as attorneys this battle of powers of attorney, where everybody has a power of attorney. You've got a power of attorney. You've got a power of attorney. Whose power of attorney prevails? Again, that's why that planning ahead piece and making sure that everybody is at that table and conversation, so we know what mom's wishes are, really helps to minimize or prevent that conflict down the road.
And by the way, next month's episode is in fact demystifying estate planning. So we're going to talk about in real basic concepts, what is a power of attorney? What is a healthcare surrogate? What is a trust? If I have a trust, do I need a will? Well, I have a living will. I don't need a will. Well, yeah, you do. So we're going to break it down and help you with some of these pre-planning concepts, so it won't be so intimidating, hopefully, and that you understand, what you need to know before you go to the lawyer to get these documents in place.
make sure that your fiduciary also knows that they're your fiduciary, because designating them on paper and them actually stepping in when the time is right or needed are two different things. Also make sure that you have frank, meaningful conversations with family members about caregiving. One of the resources that we'll provide later, and that is in the chat right now, is a family care agreement or contract that I think is a great resource, because it gets people to sit down at the table and talk about, okay, how are we going to provide for mom's care? If that means somebody is giving up their job or really taking on that full-time job of being a caregiver, how are we fairly compensating them? Because we talk about those slippery slopes of how things start. It oftentimes does start with something innocuous like, well, I'm driving mom around and I've been buying things for her out of my own account, so I'm going to reimburse myself. Or, as I'm buying things for mom, maybe I'll treat myself. Or, you know what? I'm entitled to be fairly compensated, so I'm going to start paying myself. These different things can snowball and really create a dangerous and financially devastating situation for a vulnerable person. And one other resource that I want to mention, every state has some form of legal aid provider, and it varies from state to state. Florida has a senior legal helpline where older adults can call and get advice over the phone. And every legal aid organization, every state's legal aid organizations have some form of Older American Act funding that it means that they help older adults with situations that may deal with exploitation. Like if somebody quit claims their property and puts it into their son's name, but now their son's trying to sell it out from underneath them. That's when having somebody who you can go to and ask about your legal rights and remedies is really important. So look for those providers and free resources that are available.
And we're going to wrap it up here, Michelle, and you can take us out. But Casey, you've got a great story here, and I have a feeling that some of the things we've just covered will be helpful for you. The answer to your question and about who to call. If you are claiming that it's a certified care manager, that's the Aging Life Care Association. Just as Karen mentioned, if it's an attorney, you go to the bar. If it's a doctor, you go to the AMA. You go to their governing institution, and in that case it would be the Aging Life Care Association, and report that individual. That might get the cogs moving in that action. And also check and see your legal aid society, and also if there's an elder abuse hotline in your state that you could call. That should get you some traction in that issue.
Well, I know we've got a ton of other resources and things we can share. I want to make sure that everyone knows that AARP and AARP Florida are both resources that you can turn to. We have a fraud resource page that also has information about exploitation and how to respond. So if you'd like to learn more, especially for Floridians, that's aarp.org/FL fraud. And we have a Fraud Watch network and helpline at the national level that can help walk people through these situations and give advice. So check it out online, the Fraud Watch network, or aarp.org/fraud helpline. Those are two resources that I really love, and I think that you'll find are helpful in scenarios where you're like, what do I do next? Who can I turn to?
Well, thank you, AARP, for all of these great resources. And thank you, Karen, for what you're doing and all the help you're bringing to many thousands of people across the state and wider.
And thank you, Darby, for helping us make all of this information possible for AARP members and friends across the country. Big thanks to my teammate, Karen, for bringing you're the issue expert on this. And so we are so excited that you were able to join us. This was a lot of great information. I have a feeling that everyone who has joined us has experienced fraud or knows someone who has, and those stories are important. So please do. The information that you heard today, don't keep it to yourself. Let your friends and family know, because that's how they're going to help to identify those red flags and know how and when to report them. So big thanks to all of you. Just a reminder, we mentioned a lot of resources and links, and we were sharing a few of those in the chat. Don't worry if you didn't get a chance to look at those or jot those down, because we are going to send out an email a little bit later today to everyone who participated. That email is going to include links to all of the resources we mentioned. It's going to have a link to the Aging Academy website hosted by the Professional Fiduciary Council of Florida, where you can watch all of the past episodes. This episode, give us a few days, but Chandra will have it up and running in no time, and you'll have some great information there. Darby's contact information is also available so that you can reach out to her. And if you're not in Florida, that's okay, because we're happy to do a little bit of research for you. So let us know, and we're happy to connect you with resources in your community as well. And we hope that you will join us next month. It's going to be on Thursday, July 18th, 1 o'clock Eastern time. And as Darby mentioned, we're going to demystify estate planning. So we're going to talk trusts. We're going to talk probate. What are they? Pros and cons, the good, the bad, the ugly. And so
I got a list of the top 10 things to know before you go to your estate planning attorney.
Exactly. So we do hope that you will join us July 18th. And in the meantime, check out the AARP virtual calendar to see all the other ways that you can connect with AARP across the country. Great information and resources to be shared. We hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.